These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down, get off.
Welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, reflections on autonomy, direct democracy, and marronage with Modibo Kadalie. Africa World Now Project is next. Is part of a 4-part series where we explore autobiographically the origins of Modibo Kadalie's perspectives on direct democracy, autonomy, Black radical labor history, and Pan Africanism. This part of the conversation will explore in more detail Modibo's experience in Detroit, paying attention to the efforts to develop a sharper analysis that can inform various movements more clearly, then and now. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descended communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, Ghana, Ayiti, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Listen intently, think critically, act accordingly.
Summer of 1968, man, Detroit was on fire. It was. And that momentum continued through the next year because there was a big demonstration downtown. All of these organizations were working together during that time. And then somehow it just started ebbing because organizations started becoming organized. And then people started developing democratically centralized leadership cadre. People trying to do different kinds of stuff, but the organization began to ebb, and we were trying to organize the league. I was on the central staff of the league, which was the executive board was the founding members of the organization. And then they never did have an election or anything. And sometimes they were not in touch with what the organization was doing. And it was a very confusing time after a while. And then as time went on, they began factions started developing. There was the nationalist faction, the Marxist-Leninist faction, the cultural nationalist faction. The documents are pretty much, I tried to document some of it in this old raggedy book here called Internationalism, Pan Africanism, and the Struggle of Social Classes. And I got a chapter in here on the League. Chapter 5, it's entitled The League of Revolutionary Black Workers. Chapter 5. Next time I see you, I'm gonna have a copy of it, and then I'll just give it to you.
Okay. Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Yeah, I think I missed that. So fractions are starting to develop, and this is coming out of the idea of the centralization or the structural process.
Structuring process.
That really becomes, I guess, provide an assessment of that. Like, this whole process of the idea of because most people think organization is a bureaucracy, right? This process is,
but I outlined that there was a retreat that we had, and Ernie M. Kalimoto, Ernie Allen, he later became an academic over in UMass, and he presented a paper with a class analysis of the different factions in the league, and people took that personally, took it as if he was attacking them personally. And I had gone to Washington, D.C. to a meeting down there talking about getting some resources for the league. I came back, I found out I was purged. You know, they never even, what was happening is a lot of resources were coming in to the organization, and the organization never had a specific channel for all of the resources to be appropriated and everything. So it just got to be difficult, very, very difficult. I can talk to you specifically about the league, but it just wasn't clear ideologically where we were going. And I found out that a lot of organizations were having the same problem. The problem, the situation resulted and was worked out with factions coalescing around certain personalities and coalescing around these different personalities. And there's no meetings. The meetings were not being documented or anyway recorded. And so people didn't know what was said from one meeting to another.
So it seems like, you know, again, the structuring process kind of took over, particularly around the personalities that were kind of leading, you know, these things.
And so in the process, me and some more people, we were just trying to find our way through this morass too, because we weren't that clear. We knew that there was no elections being held. We knew that there was no way that the organization, that the election, the board, the executive board was in touch with the lower level of the organization. It was just all kind of stuff in the middle. And so that's when I got in touch with CLR, that faction of CLR.
Can I pause you just one second?
Yeah.
I just want to just go back just a minute here. You know, you go down to DC and you're purged. You know, was there any type of they were just going through a purge process?
No. What happened was I was also writing articles for the Inner City Voice, which is the lead newspaper. So I called the editor and I said, "Well, I'm writing something on what was I writing? I was writing something on East Africa or something." And I told him it was ready, and he said, "Ready? I guess you haven't heard." I said, "No, I've been out of town." He said, "You've been purged." I said, "Well, who?" So they purged me and my wife then. Ernie was purged. Anybody who had a voice that they looked at as being contrary to what the voice of the executive. In other words, you couldn't speak, you couldn't give forth an analysis of the league without it being approved by the executive committee. So I was shocked, man. I was shocked. But we'd already set up like a community organizing cadre. So we just went on and kept working, you know. The PAC was good.
Talk a little bit more about, you know, that, and also in relation to you getting in touch with CLR James as well, like coming into contact. Could you talk about that cadre, that community cadre development? Yeah,
that community cadre developed out of the same people who came as a result of the Highland Park Community College strike for Black Studies. And in the meantime, I also taught. That a year later, I taught at the University of Detroit, so there was some cadre there, and we were struggling for curriculum changes in the Black Studies at the University of Detroit. So we would meet on Sunday morning at 9 o'clock every Sunday morning, and we were a loose group of people. We call ourselves the PAC, the People's Action Committee. It's confusing because there was a cultural nationalist group called the Pan Africanist Congress, which has a higher public profile than we did. But when we looked at the People's Action Committee, and I looked at what was going on with the mass movement, the People's Action Committee had more direct contact with community control issues, student strikes, even worker strikes, you know. Because Highland Park was was a junior college. Highland Park Community College was a junior college. Well, most of the workers, they were either workers in the plants or the children of workers in the plants. So it was rooted. It was rooted. And we were leaderless. We just met in the apartment downstairs from my house. You know, we were self-directed. Always we would read a book, and then the next time we would choose a book, or somebody wanted to come in, that bring in somebody who had some issues with a school issue or any kind of issue. And then we had Walter Rodney came in. He was at the University of Michigan, and he came and spoke to us for 2 or 3 times. And that's how we got in touch. That's how we got in touch with the people who did the African Liberation Support Committee. C.L.R. James was more or less, he would come by my house with a white guy named Willie Gorman. And they had a bookstore up on Woodward. But C.L.R., I think he lived in Chicago then. He would come through sometime. And what happened was, me and a friend of mine, we were out one Saturday just enhancing our library.
I'd like to hear you with that.
we stumbled upon the Face Reality bookstore on Woodward Avenue. And they had rented a space in this commercial space where it had a window here, but you had to go upstairs to get to their part. There was Willie up there, so we talked to Willie, and Willie asked me what kind of books was I reading, and I told him I was trying to understand this dialectic stuff. I didn't quite get that. I kept because to me it was because we were being reorganized, and the dialectic had to have some relevancy for us. So he said, "What about if I can get CLR to come here and do a study group for about 3 or 4 weeks, and we can come up with something." So he came, and we had a study group up there, just about the 4 of us, and then he issued this notes on the dialectic. So I was glad to see that he did that. But I think CLR was around, and he was getting some kind of criticism because he wasn't black enough. There were some people who was black, and so that's when they issued History of Pan African Revolts, the first edition, and that had an impact too. But what they were pushing, it's really strange. They were pushing this little bitty pamphlet. I don't know if I can put my hand on a copy now, but a little bit of pamphlet called "Every Cook Can Govern." And they would slide it in, like notes on the dialect, they would slide it in there. And I'd be like, where did this come from? I read it, you know.
Mm-hmm. And this is important in the context of, obviously CLR James has a particular political philosophy and ideological propensity, and also pushing against these doctrinaire.
Yeah, he was. And he come by my house, and we'd sit up and talk. He and Gorman and myself and my wife at the time. She didn't like him because them guys smoked a lot. But I mean, I had no idea that these guys were historical figures. They were just people who were trying to understand what was going on at the time.
Along with you.
Yeah, I was. I was trying to understand what was going on at the time. Yeah. I'm trying to remember the context of a particular discussion that would hang. I think the whole idea that I would be jamming them up on the fact that the Athenians had slaves, and that the Athenians didn't allow women to participate in public life. And I thought that CLR was apologizing for that, so I couldn't get past that. So,
and this is also why, some folk look at CLR James as not being black enough, which is very,
that's right.
very interesting, because he's reading these particular, histories, because of course he's very clear about how they have trickled down throughout our historical epoch, like this Western civilization, the imposition of these particular ideas and the contradictions and the dialectics that come out of that. And he's reading this, but again, as someone that, such as yourself, you're like, well, hey, we got to pay attention to this innate process of the othering or the structure of enslavement that is integrated into that as well. And it's very interesting because a lot of people still held on to this. People don't necessarily understand and really read T.L.R. James in a more and again, you're doing this, but also at the same time, also critiquing some of the fundamental ideas that are being there as well.
Yeah. But when he came out with History of Pan African Revolts, I said, well, damn, but he is black, huh?
Yeah.
But Frantz Fanon had settled the neo-colonialism thing with me. I was clear when he end violence versus nonviolence. I was clear on that. He talked about nonviolence as a way of which you can psychologically cleanse yourself. And plus, they put out a book earlier in French called, Black Skin, White Mass, which was a similar dilemma to what Du Bois was doing about his conflict between Western society and being black.
The double consciousness.
So, yeah. So all of that was working out.
So just to back up just a little bit, so Fanon is talking about not nonviolence but violence as a cleansing.
Yeah, it's a cleansing psychological. Yeah. Not only that, it's the only way that you can do it. He said you can't do it unless you destroy all of that stuff inside you and inside the institutions of the society you're struggling with. And he was clear as a bell. And he was a young man too, man. He was. I guess he'd be old now, but during that time, man, he was less than about 25, 26 years old.
Yeah, and it's very clear. So you're in Detroit. You're moving. You're evolving. And you're in a particular environment where there's these factions that are developing. There's this ideological, concretization of some, particular dogmatic ideas. But you are moving through these particular spaces in a particular way that eventually moves you into, so talk a little bit more about like C.L.R. James's impact, but also again, thinking about, the re-release of Kimathi Muhammad.
Kimathi came down. No, he didn't come down. A friend of his came down to, we had a big picket line in the front of Highland Park Community College, the biggest picket line I ever seen, man. It was about 200 people out there. And General Baker was on the horn, man. General Baker's a good agitator, man. He was on the horn and he was saying, Ingawa, black power. Ingawa, black power. And everybody was responding to him too, because we young, man. And he was definite. And then he accentuated his thing. He said, Uhuru. So that was black, right? Black power, black. He was a good agitator. Kimathi had a group up there in Lansing, centered around the Garvey Institute. Now there were a couple of things happening on campus. The campus faction had split over black studies. One group wanted to change the curriculum in the academy itself. Another group said, hell no, we need to go to the black community because we need to be aware and be informed of what the black community was doing and make our changes there. So Kimathi's faction had left University of Michigan. I'm not University, Michigan State, and going out in the community and established institute, Marcus Garvey Institute, and he attracted a lot of young guys. Now, the Panthers was not that influential in Lansing, but that young group of guys, and they were male chauvinists too, centered around Kimathi. Now, Kimathi was from Savannah. He went to school in one of the schools they used to play us basketball. But I didn't know him then. So I decided, at his invitation, I just went up there to find this Negro. So I drove up there And there he was. I never seen him before. We talk all day and all night, man. All day and all night. I think I spent the whole weekend up there. And we had come to some of the same conclusions about stuff. And so we've been friends ever since till the day he died.
What are some of those conclusions? But again, I want to go right. It's very interesting.
Well, he was clear on the relationship with the Vanguard Party. See, Lee was trying to reorganize. He said, and then he didn't put out the pamphlet. I got the pamphlet here, the old pamphlet right there. This is the old one here. Organization and Spontaneity, the theory of the Vanguard Party and its application to the black movement in the U.S. today. And he basically said it's irrelevant. You know, that's clear as a bell for this was published in 1973, but the discussion began in 1969. Yeah. It's not recorded. It's not recorded. See, when you go to the library and do research, or you're gonna find out what he said here and what Malcolm said. You know, that's all you're gonna see. But here, this guy was doing a critique of the Vanguard Party. Oh, look at this, man. This is a picture of his obituary. I mean, his funeral thing right here. That's him. You get a good look at him. Yeah, that's my man. Guy about this tall.
You know, these conclusions that are being drawn are obviously this experience in Detroit that is a stop in the culmination as you're developing your experiences. This is an important like catalyst.
Yeah. You know, but Kimathi, let me just say this. Kimathi knew C.L.R. James before I did. And I just happened to stumble on, really in a real sense, it was through C.L.R. and some of the cadre around him that I was able to get to Kimathi. And that's how I found out he was from Savannah. I didn't know he was from Savannah. He went to the same Catholic school that Clarence Thomas went to. they're all geechies.
Yeah, and that is a program on its own right there. Like, you talk about contradictions, man.
Well, I mean, you got to, people take off their education in different ways, you know.
Yeah. I want to just take a little bit back up to Black studies and the kind of split between, you know, being rooted on campus and being rooted in the Black community, because I'm thinking about that. I've been thinking about this for, a number of years, and I've actually written on this, this notion of, Black studies and its movement and entrenchment in the academy, the Euro-American Academy, and how it was able to kind of take away its political propensity, but also divorce it from the community. And so what do we do with that now? Kind of like, this conversation isn't as dominant as it should be. I'm almost sure it's not dominant based upon when it was happening with you all, but it's this conversation that needs to be, because we have a whole bunch of, folk who say that they do Black studies. They look at Black studies as a profession. Black studies was a way of life born out of the experiences and how most of you all were literally trying to make sense of the world and to develop a movement and support that movement. Can say a little bit, a little bit more about.
Well, the way I conceptualize it now is like the Afro-centric movement, etc. It's purely academic. That's the people who stayed. Pan Africanism is an activist ideology with a long history. Afrocentrism is a vapid, intellectual, academic set of debates. But Pan Africanism is rooted in a social movement over time, which went through colonialism, neocolonialism. I call myself a Pan Africanist. A neo-Pan-Africanism, because initially the first part of Pan-Africanism clumped all the classes together to strive for a nation state. Afrocentrism does a similar thing. It says that there's a Black perspective on world history. So we have to. It's kind of like Carter G. Woodson. Really, you want to include black people in world history, they've been left out. That's the perspective there. And that don't take you too far down the road to trying to build a new world. But, it's a beginning and it's a perspective. But back to the people who are on the campus, they're the ones who stayed. And they're the ones who developed this Afrocentrism. And they're the ones who have all these conferences. And some good has come out of it. But they're not rooted in the community for activist social change. They don't have those kind of roots.
I want to just to be, critically. So there are a strand of folk Afrocentrists who definitely, but then there's also a strand of folk who are maybe African-centered who are trying to move in the community. And I'm thinking about, those, I think it's important for us. We're talking about, these particular strands, intellectual strands that kind of move out, folk who are just, in the academic sense of studying history, trying to, root people in history. There are efforts, or there have been efforts, of folk who kind of, how do you use this in community, aspects?
The Afrocentric people, the people who are activist Pan-Africanists, like the African Liberation Support Committee and people like that, they look at those people, the Afrocentric people, as being the academic godchild of the older cultural nationalist movement. And they call themselves nationalists. And Pan-Africanists, they call themselves Pan-African nationalists too. But Neo-Pan-Africanism don't call themselves no nationalists because they're divorced from the nation question. Plus, they have a class analysis.
Which I think is essential, very important.
It's essential. It's essential for, like, when we got into organizing for the African Liberation Support Committee, class analysis was key. You couldn't mobilize people if you were thinking about the petty bourgeoisie doing it. You had to root yourself and move from the bottom.
So I definitely want to go back and but with the sake of time, I want to definitely kind of dig down a little bit more deeper in that because you're leaving. This is also moving away from. So there's all of these things happening in Detroit. You have these different formations, intellectual formations, organizing formations. You go down to DC, find out you're being purged, or you are purged. You're thinking and writing. You meet, you hook up with the group CLR James, Facing Reality, and of course there's a split even with James Boggs. James Boggs,
but James Boggs is for the party.
Yeah,
I wasn't influenced by James Boggs at all. James Boggs was on the wrong side of the pressure.
So that's what I said. But they're all in this particular.
They're all in.
They're in this environment, right? Yeah. And this because I'm trying to make sure that we're very clear about your navigation through these particular spaces. That's what I'm trying to kind of.
I read James Boggs' pamphlet on the need for the party. What I took away, what was really important to me, is how he looked at cybernation and
automation.
Automation, yeah. I thought that was a contribution, an astute contribution. Yeah. So I didn't condemn him. I mean, I just didn't like the part about the political party. But his animation thing was right on it. And automation thing was right on it.
This notion, I guess this will probably take us off track but it's okay. All of
but that's Boggs too. All that's Boggs.
Yeah.
But I want to give him credit. You got to give him credit.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's important as we are developing in this particular epoch, right? In this particular moment, as folk are some folk are being, rapidly awoken. Some folk are, slowly kind of awake because there's things happening, whether you are conscious of them or not. There are things happening that you're going to have to be clear. And there's going to have to be a cadre of folk that are very clear in navigating these spaces as well. And what I mean here is that if we're talking about this, because there's been conversation, I just want to have a kind of like side conversation right now. There's been conversations particularly around, developing a third party. In your experiences, and you're looking at these particular things, what is the danger in that, or what is the possibilities, in those conversations?
Okay. Well, there's certain kinds of organizational formations that have outlived their usefulness and they need to be discarded. The Vanguard Party, the political party, is representative democracy, of which the Vanguard Party and all is a derivative of. Representative democracy is not useful to us anymore. I don't even know if it was useful to us at the beginning when it was being formed. It was formed out of a need to co-opt certain things, you know. So I don't even think that we needed to go through that part to understand it. And when Kimathi wrote his pamphlet, of course, there are a lot of little nuanced things that I have disagreement with him on. It needs to be put out there as a landmark kind of piece, you know. And when he wrote it, even I thought it was germane to what we needed to look at. Now, what I got out of Boggs too, Boggs was hung up with the party. Now, you know, you gotta be careful because people have political lives, and they might have articulated the question in some way at one point and articulated the question another way in another point in their life. So I'm willing to give Boggs but I give Du Bois all the credit in the world because the guy lived so long, he went through a whole bunch of changes. But he needs to be looked at in a different context as the context develops. I don't see the Vanguard Party or political party as useful at all. I think it would just exacerbate sectarianism, elitism, and all the things we need to get away from. And it shows a lack of analysis of the historical development of these institutions. See, you just can't reach into history and say, look, he did that, he was cool, so we can do that. You gotta look at what was going on and what's happening and all that. So it's not overly complicated, but it's definitely not simple. The Vanguard Party came into being in a certain context, and it's outlived its usefulness at all, if it had a usefulness at all. So I don't. When somebody started talking about trying to form a black political party, I said, man, that's a waste of time. I'm going the other direction, really. And if I get a chance, I'm gonna critique them because I don't think they need to be going down in that direction either. Everything ain't right all the time, you know, and everything is not accurate either. You know, you have to do the research and figure out what works and what doesn't. And I don't see why people are still trying to do that. It's failed. Let's go on to something else.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it, we often, you know, as someone we talked earlier about, you know, the psychological impact on consciousness development and the psychological impact of the social environment that creates or limits the consciousness development. And so when you mentioned, you know, this notion of representative democracy, there's a faction of folk who are so wedded to that mythical idea because they're ultimately wedded to the nation state itself. That there's space that's there that is theirs, right?
Yeah, and the Democrat and the party is a derivative of the representative democracy in the nation. They didn't develop what other context did it come out of?
Right, right. So you're coming to these conclusions based upon these experiences in Detroit. Talk a little bit more about the African Liberation Support Movement and how that what drew you into that, and why was it important for you and the collective and the folk that you were engaged with to actually be thinking about, we talked about Pan Africanism, because Pan Africanism is there, right? You know, this notion of unifying the African world to struggle for liberation and against imperialist and colonialist ideas. What was the impact? The African Liberation Support Movement, this is obviously in the 70s, mid-70s, 74, 72, 70, 70.
Well, the first one was ALD 72.
Right, 72.
Then ALD 73 and 74.
Right.
74 was decentralized. The 72 was the big initial march in Washington.
Talk a little bit more about that. What drew you in? Because again, you're in Detroit
we're in Detroit. I've been purged. We had the little study group in Highland Park. Owusu, Sadoki, and Nelson Johnson. Nelson Johnson was putting out a paper called a newspaper called. These organizations sometimes are hard to figure out, but SOBU, which is the Student Organization for Black Unity, headed by Nelson Johnson, was an outgrowth of SNCC. SNCC split over the black question, independent black organization. Some of them still say that we need to have a black and white organization. When Stokely came up, it needed to be black. Following that, you had the organization of SOBU, the Student Organization for Black Unity, under Nelson Johnson in Greensboro. Owusu, who was a black, he was an organizer, but he was a public. There was a lot of money being spread out in the black community by the federal government to co-opt the mass movement of the 1960s. And so you had all kind of poverty programs and all kind of things like that. Wusu was a I don't want to say a creature of that kind of organization, but he came into being as a result of the use of some of that money for independent black education. Now, Owusu and Nelson had gotten together because they were in North Carolina. Owusu was in Greensboro and Nelson was in Greensboro. And they had gotten some money and they went to Africa. And there was some people from the old days of SNCC still in Africa. Some of them left and some of them went to Guyana, some of them went to Tanzania. And they started when Owusu was over there, he went to the place in Tanzania because the Tanzanian government was supporting these African liberation struggles in Southern Africa. So Owusu went and visited Mozambique, during the northern province, Mozambique. Anyway, he came back and, he asked the people, what can he do? And he said, well, you can help publicize this, that we're fighting over here for this, because the media is controlled by people who are beholden to the imperialist interests, the oil companies and the financial institutions that was interested in continuing to operate through Portugal and to keep the provinces in a colonial direct control state. So he came back and they made a film as a result of the trip in the liberated zones that he had visited. And the film is called A Luta Continua. I don't know if you've seen that movie. Anyway, he began to go around the country in places like Detroit and other places to organize a big march in Washington, D.C. in ALD 72. We were in Detroit. Our little study group was in Detroit. And the PAC was in Detroit. The Pan Africanist Congress was in Detroit. So they made contact with us, and we said, we'd get a busload of people over there for you, So we got a busload of people over there, and I don't, it's a strange thing that happens when you get that many people together. But there was a lot of people in Washington, D.C. on ALD 72. And everybody was shocked, including Owusu. I don't think he had no idea it was going to be that many people. And when there was about 10, 15,000 people there. And when they saw that, they said, well, we might as well organize the next year to make this an annual thing. And that's when all these local groups started coming in, and it got bigger. And then we started organizing a coordinating committee and decentralized it and raised more money. And so all these questions came up as a result of our organizing effort. And that's I think that's chapter 6 in this book, too. The thing that was being debated then was, were there classes in the Black community? Or was that class analysis irrelevant? And so what I did is I wrote a pamphlet saying that it was, and did a class analysis. It had 2 essays in it. One essay was called The Class Origin and Nature of Contending Ideologies Within Black Society.
And this was the primary question, obviously in the community, but also in movement spaces, because obviously
it was. And so I was call myself contributing to that. And the young people at that point, man, they ate it up. I mean, that was us then. I mean, those were the young people. We were the, and a year later, that rose as a. I mean, I wanted to show how it was important for practices and mobilization too, But you had to do the analysis that I wanted to offer. But later, I realized that it was a part of the what was being debated in the ALSC then. And they went after it, man. I just sat back and watched. I said, well, look here.
And your so talk about a little bit of this notion of race and class. Of course, this is coming out of by the time you get to the African Liberation Support period, you're coming out of Detroit, right?
Yeah.
And this question
like proletariat at the point of production. Yeah,
right,
sure. I was clear then.
Yeah,
no question about it.
Yeah,
but a lot of other people weren't, and then in the ALSC, the people who were mobilizing these people were coming out of poverty pimp tradition too, and that's basically the praxis that informed their ideological thinking at that time.
This notion of race and class, I mean, of course, CLR James is in this particular space. He's wrote as far back as the 50s and also 30s on this particular question as well.
And Du Bois. And Du Bois, Black Reconstruction, sure he was.
Absolutely. So that informed the work not only because one of the things you just said, I think is important, having an intellectual debate of the notion of race versus class or the practice of race and class analysis becomes two different types of frameworks, right? Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Because of course, it guided our. Where do we emphasize our mobilization? Do we go into first? Do we take money from the government because a lot of people were being elected to local positions and even the National Black Caucus. As a matter of fact, the National Black Caucus sponsored the panel at Howard, and they were new. And they were disoriented, really. They were, but they were black, and they wanted to mobilize some black people. So when I saw that at Howard, I didn't want to jam up Owusu and them, but I wanted them to focus on class analysis in the black community so that we can mobilize the people. And so we decided in Detroit that we weren't going to have no black politicians on the platform speaking because they deserve no special privilege. They could they could march in the parade and participate with everybody else. And the second thing is we wanted to make sure that the everyday working people made a contribution and began to have knowledge of the struggle in Southern Africa, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, Angola, and South Africa too, and of course later Zimbabwe. But the thing that I was emphasizing is that was important to our practice. It wasn't just an intellectual debate. And we were able to mobilize them. And then I was arguing in the International Steering Committee to decentralize the next demonstration. Take it out of Washington. Put it in Detroit. Put it in Youngstown, Ohio. And put it in Greensboro, North Carolina. Put it in D.C. too. D.C. was part of it. And then have a criteria for judging people, not by their rhetoric, but by how much money they raise from the masses, not by no corporate donations, and how many people they mobilized at their local ALD demonstration. That determined where you went. Do you go to City Hall or do you go to the factories floor? Do you go to the factories to mobilize people? Do you go to Congressman John Conyers and dictate or become a part of your committee, or do you have the everyday activists as part of your committee? And so we were next meeting after the ALD 74, we had a meeting. And all we were interested in is not no talking. How many people came to your demonstration? How much money you got in? Or a real criteria for praxis. In retrospect, that was a turning point in the LSC. So to me, ALSC did not break up. People look at it as, well, it broke up over these meaningless discussions. But no, it just changed form. It morphed. And other organizations came about. That's what happened. People began to see that. And of course, I don't know, what's that name of that organization in the late 80s that occurred and it was re-centralized again? What was that organization called?
You're not talking about Trans-Africa, are you?
Trans-Africa, yeah.
Okay.
And when the history is written, Trans-Africa gets credit for mobilizing the support for those struggles. In addition to that, when those people, even in the areas which were in struggle, they didn't know about us, but we tried to put it on the agenda for them and move it forward.
So I wanted to go back to this notion of the decentralization, because I think that is a very important, because what happens is that if it becomes so centralized, and you're talking about the movement, the African Liberation Support Movement being centralized in a particular geographical area that also pulls intellectual resources as well, spreading it out becomes important in the context that now you're also paying attention to what is happening at the local level if you're moving around in a particular place. So this decentralization is also a theme, right? Because the dictates become important, how things coalesce or concretize themselves into very, very inflexible ideological instances become important. Talk a little bit more.
Yeah, a lot of local, at that meeting, as I remember that meeting after the decentralized effort, there are a lot of local people that many people hadn't seen came to that meeting. And they were talking, because we had the meeting in North Carolina and it was a retreat, and it turned into a real ideological struggle. And that's when the ALSC started. You see all that literature that began to be generated at that time. And it's based upon class, but they say Marxist versus not. And it was a very important part of Leroy Jones, Imamu Baraka's transition. He was a straight up cultural nationalist when he first joined the LSC. Just before he died, we had a conversation about that. And he thanked me. I said, well, what did I do? He said, man, you played up. But he was sick then. And I had just come back from Africa. We talked in D.C., matter of fact.
Okay. One of the last sentences, I remember he was actually in D.C. and a few months later, because he was doing something, Tom Porter actually was with him in D.C. as well, because he was at the Bohemian Caverns, I believe. And then, months later, I think it was January of February, something like that. But let's piggyback, really quickly, because there is a number of debates.
If you look at that tape, Baraka was attempting to answer the question about the black bourgeoisie. Owusu dismissed the question. Baraka was really trying to get at it, and you could tell it was turning over in his mind. See, Baraka is a real transitional figure. He went from the Black Arts Movement to the cultural nationalist stuff, and he ended up being a Marxist of a sort. But he always was rooted in Newark. And so you can trace, in many ways, you can trace the transition of the movement through him. He was really trying to deal with something, and he was.
Thank you for interjecting that, because this notion of a Marxist of a sort was actually a better way that I was actually going to form my question, because their practice, also intellectual merging with that. It's interesting that you said that. I'm glad you interjected. I don't know if you were kind of on my thought process of where I was leading to.
Well, but the material conditions developed, and we just tracing what was happening in the mass movement, really.
Yeah. But a lot of people miss that point, though. I mean, people get, folk really get caught up in one side or the other. So talk a little bit more about this, because all of you are moving in a particular space, and the material conditions, the objective conditions, the country, all of these things are becoming apparent. But at the same time, you all are very clear about, the merging of these particular categories of thinking, race, class, genders. Talk a little bit more. Obviously, this is also, we're talking about Mary Rock, but you are literally moving in this particular space as well. Your thoughts are moving in some would say in a particular advanced understanding of really coming to a realization of the inhibitors, nation state, these particular structures that are inhibiting the evolution part. Just, jump in there any way you want.
Trans-Africa was a resurrection and a throwback. It was, a lot of people look at that as the pinnacle, but that was the way in which history is rewritten and distorted. It was let me just say this. Pan Africanism is an ideology rooted in international activism. It was a clear projection of where the world was going, but it centralized and focused on, or at least most of the sections of it centralized and focused on the nation state. And that's why you got Nkrumah coming out so hard. But, he got deposed. He ended up in Guinea. He ended up dying. Then he ended up, just like Barack, he ended up putting out a book called Class Struggle in Africa. So his transition was to what I call neo-Pan-Africanism. A Pan-Africanism rooted in the masses that was a part of the anti-imperialist struggle. The imperialists tried to co-opt it by imposing certain nation states and putting certain people, certain classes in power. So you can't go from classical Pan-Africanism to neo-Pan-Africanism without a class analysis. You can't do it. Intellectually, you can't do it. So pivotal to that, as you point out, is Du Bois, CLR. These guys were trying to make the transition to neo-Pan-Africanism. In the meantime, you had a parallel struggle, a concomitant struggle on Black studies, Afrocentrism. Afrocentrism is a ideological academic discussion mimicking, but it's the shadow of the Pan-African. It's an epiphenomenon of it. It wasn't real. Let me just explain what I mean by epiphenomenon. Epiphenomena is something that is real, but it's not real in the form that you can see it. It's like moonlight. Moonlight is real. You can see it, but it's not really moonlight. It's reflected sunlight. So the Malefi and all the guys who are struggling in the academic arena, they're epiphenomenal of a mass struggle in the third world for Pan-Africanism. They never developed a class analysis. They didn't have to because they didn't have their feet in the mass struggle. So they end up being on cloud nine somewhere, if you follow them. And so there's no neo Afrocentrism. They swallowed the state paradigm hook, line, and sinker. They were looking for Black kings, male kings. They were looking for Black societies. They were just saying that y'all said that it was European. We got some African Europeans too, So, but it was an epiphenomenal reflection of the Pan-African struggle, which was moving from classical Pan-Africanism to neo-Pan-Africanism. So I have to make that distinction. Sometimes people just clump all of them together and they can't go nowhere because they don't have the definitions of the terms that they're using. So it's hard to discuss things with them. They know it. They know every goddamn thing, But they get to define the terms. They get to define the terms of their argument anytime, any way they want to. So it's hard to follow them. But there's some real people who make the transition and try to deal with it. I think you have to respect Nkrumah for that. And you have to respect Du Bois. Look at the journey of Du Bois. But the people who are leaving out, Garvey was not. He didn't make a transition very much. He was stuck. If you don't watch it, we can get stuck too, because things are moving on. And I'm fortunate to have, long life where I can see that. It's like I noticed that in CLR. CLR, if he died in the 1940s, we would know him, but we wouldn't know what he could have become.
The transition becomes important. And that transition is not, if I'm reading you, very clearly, it's not just this non-materiality. There is, you kind of whimsical. These transitions are based upon, obviously the conditions And as these conditions are changing as well, which is important because we're in an epoch now that things are, when you talk about factory floor, we now have to add in gig economy, right?
Yeah, you do.
We have to understand that the evolution. So how do we understand, those particular transitions and how we address the contradictions that also reinforce the systems of oppression become important.
Let me tell you this, young man. you got to be brave, because you ain't gonna never become no president in no school. You ain't gonna never you can become a head of a department until they start fighting, and then they'll fire you. Du Bois was brave. I mean, that guy went through a transition. He was purged, and he formed something else. Then he tried to go to the black colleges. They fired him. Then he went up north. So he was still struggling. And so the transition is based upon a certain amount of intellectual honesty and downright courage. If you're on a career track thing, yeah, you ain't gonna become rich and famous. Not while you're living anyway. Well, you ain't gonna become rich. You can't become rich when you're dead. But you just got to be brave. Look at CLR. I mean, he went to Trinidad, and his good friend Eric Williams put him in jail, man. Look at Nkrumah. He tried to do that. He made the error of misjudging things. He ended up in exile. He could have been assassinated, really. So it gets deadly, really. And so you got to be intellectually brave and honest, because the masses will take you places that are very uncomfortable to go, but you got to go. You got to go. And when I look back at my career, I lost a couple of wives behind me. I mean, these women married me when I was...
That's it for Africa Woke Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. Follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ. Instagram at Africa Woke Now Project. Access to our other media platforms can be reached through the bios of our social media. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa Woke Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Moiza Muntali, Africa Woke Now Project media correspondent Funa Ngonda, senior research, content contributor, and production director Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, senior research, content contributor, and production associate Dr. Josh Myers, content contributor and filmmaker Kurt Watterson, technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technologies, and creative directors, international creative and artist designer Tabassum Siddiqui and Judah Pope. Africa Woke Now Project can be heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcast service of Winston-Salem State University. Programs are archived and available on all podcast platforms. Search Africa Woke Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.